Volume One, Chapter 6 of Clayhanger, by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. In the House. To return to Edwin. On that Friday afternoon of the breaking up, he was, in the local phrase, at a loose end. That is, he had no task, no programme, and no definite desires. Not knowing when he started out in the morning whether school would formally end before or after the dinner hour, he had taken his dinner with him as usual, and had eaten it at Oldcastle. Thus, though the family dinner had not begun when he reached home, he had no share in it, partly because he was not hungry, and partly because he was shy about having left school. The fact that he had left school affected him as he was affected by the wearing of a new suit for the first time, or by the cutting of his hair after a prolonged neglect of the barber. It inspired him with a wish to avoid his kind, and especially his sisters Maggie and Clara. Clara might make some facetious remark. Edwin could never forget the Red Indian glee with which Clara had danced around him when for the first time, and quite unprepared for the exquisite shock, she had seen him in long trousers. There was also his father. He wanted to have a plain talk with his father. He knew that he would not be at peace until he had had that talk. And yet, in spite of himself, he had carefully kept out of his father's way during all the afternoon, save for a moment when, strolling with affected nonchalance up to Darius's private desk in the shop, he had dropped thereon his school report, and strolled off again. Towards 6 o'clock he was in his bedroom, an attic with a floor very much more spacious than its ceiling, and a window that commanded the slope of Trafalgar Road towards Bleakridge. It had been his room, his castle, his sanctuary, for at least 10 years, since before his mother's death of cancer. He did not know that he loved it, with all its inconveniences and makeshifts, but he did love it, and he was jealous for it. No one should lay a hand on it to rearrange what he had once arranged. His sisters knew this, the middle-aged servant knew it, even his father, with a curt laugh, would humorously acquiesce in the theory of the sacredness of Edwin's bedroom. As for Edwin, he saw nothing extraordinary in his attitude concerning his bedroom, and he could not understand, and he somewhat resented, that the household should perceive anything comic in it. He never went near his sister's bedroom, never wished to go near it, never thought about it. TWO. Now he sat idly on the patchwork counterpane of his bed and gazed at the sky. He was feeling a little happier, a little less unsettled, for his stomach was empty, and his mind had begun to fix itself with pleasure on the images of hot toast and jam. He wanted his tea. The manner in which he glanced at his old silver watch proved that. He wished only that before 6 o'clock struck he could settle upon the necessary changes in his bedroom. A beautiful schooner, which for over a year, with all sails spread, had awaited the breeze in a low dark corner to the right of the window, would assuredly have to be dismissed to the small empty attic. Once that schooner had thrilled him. The slight rake of its masts and the knotted reality of its rigging had thrilled him, and to navigate it had promised the most delicious sensations conceivable. Now one moment it was a toy, as silly as a doll, and the next moment it thrilled him once more, and he could believe again its promises of bliss. And then he knew that it was for ever a vain toy, and he was sad, and his sadness was pleasure. He had already stacked most of his school books in the other attic. He would need a table and a lamp. He knew not for what precise purpose, but a table and a lamp were necessary to the continuance of his self-respect. The only question was, should he remodel his bedroom, or should he demand the other attic, and plant his flag in it and rule over it in addition to his bedroom? Had he the initiative and the energy to carry out such an enterprise? He was not able to make up his mind, and moreover he could not decide anything until after that plain talk with his father. His sister Clara's high voice sounded outside on the landing or half-way up the attic stairs. "Edwin! Edwin!" "What's up?" he called in answer, rising with a nervous start. The door of the room was unlatched. "You're mighty mysterious in your bedroom," said Clara's voice behind the door. "Come in! Come in! Why don't you come in?" he replied, with good-natured impatience. But somehow he could not speak in a natural tone. The mere fact that he had left school that day, and that the world awaited him, and that everybody in the house knew this, rendered him self-conscious. THREE. Clara entered with a curious sidelong movement, half winning and half serpentine. She was aged 14, a very fair and very slight girl, with a thin face and thin lips, and extraordinarily slender hands, in general appearance fragile. She wore a semicircular comb on the crown of her head, and her abundant hair hung over her shoulders in two tight pigtails. Edwin considered that Clara was harsh and capricious. He had much fault to find with her, but nevertheless the sight of her usually affected him pleasurably, of course without his knowing it, and he never for long sat definitely in adverse judgement upon her. Her gestures had a charm for him which he felt but did not realise, and this charm was similar to his own charm. But nothing would have so surprised him as to learn that he himself had any charm at all. He would have laughed and been ashamed to hear that his gestures and the play of his features had an ingratiating, awkward, and wistful grace. He would have tried to cure that. "Father wants you," said Clara, her hand on the handle of the thin attic door hung with odd garments. Edwin's heart fell instantly, and all the agreeable images of tea vanished from his mind. His father must have read the school report, and perceived that Edwin had been beaten by Charlie Orgreave, a boy younger than himself. "Did he send you up for me?" Edwin asked. "No," said Clara, frowning. "But I heard him calling out for you all over. So Maggie told me to run up. Not that I expect any thanks." She put her head forward a little. The episode and Clara's tone showed clearly the nature and force of the paternal authority in the house. It was an authority with the gift of getting its commands anticipated. "All right, I'm coming," said Edwin superiorly. "I know what you want," Clara said teasingly, as she turned towards the passage. "What do I want?" "You want the empty attic all to yourself. And a fine state it would be in a month, my word!" "How do you know I want the empty attic?" Edwin repelled the onslaught, but he was considerably taken aback. It was a mystery to him how those girls, and Clara in particular, got wind of his ideas before he had even formulated them definitely to himself. It was also a mystery to him how they could be so tremendously interested in matters which did not concern them. "You never mind," Clara gibed, with a smile that was malicious, but charmingly malicious. "I know." She had merely seen him staring into the empty attic, and from that brief spectacle she had by divination constructed all his plans. FOUR. The Clayhanger sitting-room, which served as both dining-room and drawing-room according to the more primitive practices of those days, was over one half of the shop and looked on Duck Square. Owing to its northern aspect it scarcely ever saw the sun. The furniture followed the universal fashion of horsehair, mahogany, and wool embroidery. There was a piano, with a high back, fretted wood over silk pleated in rays from the centre, a bookcase, whose lower part was a cupboard, a sofa, and a large leather easy chair which did not match the rest of the room. This easy chair had its back to the window and its front legs a little towards the fireplace, so that Mr Clayhanger could read his newspaper with facility in daytime. At night the light fell a little awkwardly from the central chandelier, and Mr Clayhanger, if he happened to be reading, would continually shift his chair an inch or two to left or right, backwards or forwards, and would also continually glance up at the chandelier, as if accusing it of not doing its best. A common sight in the sitting-room was Mr Clayhanger balanced on a chair, the table having been pushed away, screwing the newest burner into the chandelier. When he was seated in his easy chair the piano could not be played, because there was not sufficient space for the stool between the piano and his chair; nor could the fire be made up without disturbing him, because the japanned coal box was on the same side of the hearthrug as the chair. Thus, when the fire languished, and Mr Clayhanger neglected it, the children had either to ask permission to step over his legs, or suggest that he should attend to the fire himself. Occasionally, when he was in one of his gay moods, he would humorously impede the efforts of the fire maker with his feet, and if the fire maker was Clara or Edwin, the child would tickle him, which brought him to his senses and forced him to shout, "None o' that! None o' that!" The position of Mr Clayhanger's easy chair, a detail apparently trifling, was in reality a strongly influencing factor in the family life, for it meant that the father's presence obsessed the room. And it could not be altered, for it depended on the window. The window was too small to be quite efficient. When the children reflected upon the history of their childhood, they saw one important aspect of it as a long series of detached hours spent in the sitting room, in a state of desire to do something that could not be done without disturbing father, and in a state of indecision whether or not to disturb him. If by chance, as sometimes occurred, he chose to sit on the sofa, which was unobtrusive in the corner away from the window between the fireplace and the door, the room was instantly changed into something larger, freer, and less inconvenient. FIVE. As the hour was approaching 6, Edwin, on the way downstairs, looked in at the sitting room for his father, but Darius was not there. "Where's father?" he demanded. "I don't know, I'm sure," said Maggie, at the sewing machine. Maggie was aged 20, dark, rather stout, with an expression at once benevolent and worried. She rarely seemed to belong to the same generation as her brother and sister. She consorted on equal terms with married women, and talked seriously of the same things as they did. Mr Clayhanger treated her somewhat differently from the other two, yet though he would often bid them accept her authority, he would now and then impair that authority by roughly `dressing her down' at the meal table. She was a capable girl. She had much less firmness and much more good nature than she seemed to have. She could not assert herself adequately. She managed very well. Indeed, she had done wonders in filling the place of the mother who had died when Clara was 4 and Edwin 6, and she herself only 10. Responsibility, apprehension, and strained effort had printed their marks on her features. But the majority of acquaintances were more impressed by her good intention than by her capacity. They would call her a `nice thing.' The discerning minority, while saying with admiring conviction that she was a `very fine girl,' would regret that somehow she had not the faculty of `making the best of herself,' of `putting her best foot foremost.' And would they not heartily stand up for her with the superficial majority? A thin, grey-haired, dreamy-eyed woman hurried into the room, bearing a noisy tray, and followed by Clara with a white cloth. This was Mrs Nixon, the domestic staff of the Clayhanger household for years. Clara and Mrs Nixon swept Maggie's sewing materials from the corner of the table on to a chair, put Maggie's flower glasses on to the ledge of the bookcase, folded up the green cloth, and began rapidly to lay the tea. Simultaneously Maggie, glancing at the clock, closed up her sewing machine and deposited her work in a basket. Clara, leaving the table, stooped to pick up the bits of cotton and white stuff that littered the carpet. The clock struck 6. "Now, sharpy!" she exclaimed curtly to Edwin, who stood hesitatingly with his hands in his pockets. "Can't you help Maggie to push that sewing machine into the corner?" "What on earth's up?" he inquired vaguely, but starting forward to help Maggie. "She'll be here in a minute," said Maggie, almost under her breath, as she fitted on the cover of the sewing machine. "Who?" asked Edwin. "Oh, auntie! I'd forgotten it was her night." "As if anyone could forget!" murmured Clara, with sarcastic unbelief. By this time the table was completely set. SIX. Edwin wondered mildly, as he often wondered, at the extremely bitter tone in which Clara always referred to their Aunt Clara Hamps, when Mrs Hamps was not there. Even Maggie's private attitude to Auntie Clara was scarcely more Christian. Mrs Hamps was the widowed younger sister of their mother, and she had taken a certain share in the supervision of Darius Clayhanger's domestic affairs after the death of Mrs Clayhanger. This latter fact might account partially, but not wholly, for the intense and steady dislike in which she was held by Maggie, Clara, and Mrs Nixon. Clara hated her own name because she had been called after her auntie. Mr Clayhanger got on excellently with his sister-in-law. He thought highly of her, and was indeed proud to have her for a relative. In their father's presence the girls never showed their dislike of Mrs Hamps. It was a secret pleasure shared between them and Mrs Nixon, and only disclosed to Edwin because the girls were indifferent to what Edwin might think. They casually despised him for somehow liking his auntie, for not seeing through her wiles. But they could count on his loyalty to themselves. "Are you ready for tea, or aren't you?" Clara asked him. She frequently spoke to him as if she was the elder instead of the younger. "Yes," he said, "but I must find father." He went off, but he did not find his father in the shop, and after a few futile minutes he returned upstairs. Mrs Nixon preceded him, carrying the tea urn, and she told him that his father had sent word into the kitchen that they were not to wait tea for him. Chapter 6, Volume 1. Chapter 7 of Clayhanger, by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. Auntie Hamps. Mrs Hamps had splendidly arrived. The atmosphere of the sitting-room was changed. Maggie, smiling, wore her second-best black silk apron. Clara, smiling and laughing, wore a clean long white pinafore. Mrs Nixon, with her dreamy eyes less vacant than usual, greeted Mrs Hamps effusively, and effusively gave humble thanks for kind inquiries after her health. A stranger might have thought that these women were strongly attached to one another by ties of affection and respect. Edwin never understood how his sisters, especially Maggie, could practise such vast and eternal hypocrisy with his aunt. As for him, his aunt acted on him now as generally like a tonic. Some effluence from her quickened him. He put away the worry in connection with his father, and gave himself up to the physical pleasures of tea. Aunt Clara was a handsome woman. She had been called, but not by men whose manners and code she would have approved, a damned fine woman. Her age was about 40, which at that period, in a woman's habit of mind, was the equivalent of about 50 today. Her latest photograph was considered to be very successful. It showed her standing behind a velvet chair and leaning her large but still shapely bust slightly over the chair. Her forearms, ruffled and braceleted, lay along the fringed back of the chair, and from one negligent hand depended a rose. A heavy curtain came downwards out of nothing into the picture, and the end of it lay coiled and draped on the seat of the chair. The great dress was of slate-coloured silk, with sleeves tight to the elbow, and thence from a ribbon bow, broadening to a wide triangular climax that revealed quantities of lace at the wrists. The pointed ends of the sleeves were picked out with squares of velvet. A short and highly ornamental fringed and looped flounce waved grandly out behind from the waist to the level of the knees, and the stomacher recalled the ornamentation of the flounce. And both the stomacher and flounce gave contrasting value to the severe plainness of the skirt, designed to emphasise the quality of the silk. Round the neck was a lace collarette to match the furniture of the wrists, and the broad ends of the collarette were crossed on the bosom and held by a large jet brooch. Above that you saw a fine regular face, with a firm hard mouth, and a very straight nose and dark eyebrows. Small ears weighted with heavy jet earrings. The photograph could not render the clear perfection of Aunt Clara's rosy skin. She had the colour and the flashing eye of a girl, but it did justice to her really magnificent black hair. This hair was all her own,
and the coiffure seemed as ample as a judge's wig. From the low forehead the hair was parted exactly in the middle for about 2 inches. Then plaited bands crossed and recrossed the scalp in profusion, forming behind a pattern exceedingly complicated, and down either side of the head, now behind the ear, now hiding it, now resting on the shoulders, now hanging clear of them, fell long, multitudinous, glossy curls. These curls, one of them in the photograph reached as far as the stomacher, could not have been surpassed in Bursley. She was a woman of terrific vitality. Her dead sister had been nothing in comparison with her. She had a glorious digestion, and was the envy of her brother-in-law, who suffered much from biliousness, because she could eat with perfect impunity hot buttered toast and raw celery in large quantities. Further, she had independent means, and no children to cause anxieties. Yet she was always, as the phrase went, bearing up, or as another phrase went, leaning hard. Frances Ridley Havergal was her favourite author, and Frances Ridley Havergal's little book, Lean Hard, was kept on her dressing-table. The girls, however, averred that she never opened it. Aunt Clara's spiritual life must be imagined as a continual, almost physical, leaning on Christ. Nevertheless, she never complained, and she was seldom depressed. Her desire and her achievement was to be bright, to take everything cheerfully, to look obstinately on the best side of things, and to instil this religion into others. Two. Thus, when it was announced that father had been called out unexpectedly, leaving an order that they were not to wait for him, she said gaily that they had better be obedient and begin, though it would have been more agreeable to wait for father. And she said how beautiful the tea was, and how beautiful the toast, and how beautiful the strawberry jam, and how beautiful the pikelets. She would herself pour some hot water into the slop basin, and put a pikelet on a plate thereon, covered, to keep warm, for father. She would not hear a word about the toast being a little hard, and when Maggie, in her curious quiet way, stuck her out that the toast was in fact hard, she said that that precise degree of hardness was the degree which she, for herself, preferred. Then she talked of jams, and mentioned gooseberry jam, whereupon Clara privately put her tongue out, with the quickness of a snake, to signal to Maggie. "Ours isn't good this year," said Maggie. "I told auntie we weren't so set up with it a fortnight ago," said Clara simply, like a little angel. "Did you, dear?" Mrs Hamps exclaimed, with great surprise, almost with shocked surprise. "I'm sure it's beautiful. I was quite looking forward to tasting it. Quite. I know what your gooseberry jam is." "Would you like to try it now?" Maggie suggested. "But we've warned you." "Oh, I don't want to trouble you now. We're all so cosy here. Any time." "No trouble, auntie," said Clara, with her most captivating and innocent smile. "Well, if you talk about warning me, of course I must insist on having some," said Auntie Clara. Clara jumped up, passed behind Mrs Hamps, making a contemptuous face at those curls as she did so, and ran gracefully down to the kitchen. "Here," she said crossly to Mrs Nixon, "a pot of that gooseberry, please. A small one will do. She knows it's short of sugar, and so she's determined to try it, just out of spite. Nothing will stop her." Clara returned smiling to the tea-table, and Maggie neatly unsealed the jam. And Aunt Clara, with a face beaming with pleasurable anticipation, helped herself circumspectly to a spoonful. "Beautiful!" she murmured. "Don't you think it's a bit tart?" Maggie asked. "Oh no!" protestingly. "Don't you?" asked Clara, with an air of delighted deferential astonishment. "Oh no!" Mrs Hamps repeated. "It's beautiful." She did not smack her lips over it, because she would have considered it unladylike to smack her lips, but by less offensive gestures she sought to convey her unbounded pleasure in the jam. "How much sugar did you put in?" she inquired, after a while. "Half and half?" "Yes," said Maggie. "They do say gooseberries were a tiny bit sour this year, owing to the weather," said Mrs Hamps reflectively. Clara kicked Edwin under the table, as it were viciously, but her delightful, innocent smile, directed vaguely upon Mrs Hamps, did not relax. Such duplicity passed Edwin's comprehension. It seemed to him purposeless. Yet he could not quite deny that there might be a certain sting, a certain insinuation, in his auntie's last remark. THREE. Then Mr Clayhanger entered, blowing forth a long breath as if trying to repulse the oppressive heat of the July afternoon. He came straight to the table with a slightly preoccupied air, quickly, his arms motionless at his sides and slanting a little outwards. Mr Clayhanger always walked like this, with motionless arms, so that in spite of a rather clumsy and heavy step, the upper part of him appeared to glide along. He shook hands genially with Aunt Clara, greeting her almost as grandiosely as she greeted him, putting on for a moment the grand manner, not without dignity. Each admired the other. Each often said that the other was wonderful. Each undoubtedly flattered the other, made a fuss of the other. Mr Clayhanger's admiration was the greater. The bitterest thing that Edwin had ever heard Maggie say was, "It's something to be thankful for that she's his deceased wife's sister." And she had said the bitter thing with such quiet bitterness, Edwin had not instantly perceived the point of it. Darius Clayhanger then sat down with a thud, snatched at the cup of tea which Maggie had placed before him, and drank half of it with a considerable indrawing noise. No one asked where or why he had been detained. It was not etiquette to do so. If father had been called away, or had had to go away, or was kept somewhere, the details were out of deference allowed to remain in mystery, respected by curiosity. Father business. All business was sacred. He himself had inculcated this attitude. In a short silence the sound of the bell that the carman rang before the tram started for Hanbridge floated in through the open window. "There's the tram," observed Auntie Clara, apparently with warm and special interest in the phenomena of the tram. Then another little silence. "Auntie," said Clara, writhing about youthfully on her chair. "Can't you sit still a bit?" the father asked, interrupting her roughly but with good humour. "You'll be falling off the chair in a minute." Clara blushed swiftly and stopped. "Yes, love," Auntie Clara encouraged her. It was as if Auntie Clara had said, "Your dear father is of course quite right, more than right, to insist on your sitting properly at table. However, do not take the correction too much to heart. I sympathise with all your difficulties." "I was only going to ask you," Clara went on, in a weaker, stammering voice, "if you knew that Edwin's left school to day." Her archness had deserted her. Mischievous little thing, thought Edwin. Why must she deliberately go and draw attention to that? And he too blushed, feeling as if he owed an apology to the company for having left school. "Oh yes," said Auntie Clara with eager benevolence. "I've got something to say about that to my nephew." Mr Clayhanger searched in a pocket of his alpaca and drew forth an open envelope. "Here's the lad's report, auntie," said he. "Happen ye'd like to look at it." "I should indeed," she replied fervently. "I'm sure it's a very good one." FOUR. She took the paper and assumed her spectacles. "Conduct excellent," she read, poring with enthusiasm over the document. And she read again, "Conduct excellent." Then she went down the list of subjects, declaiming the number of marks for each. And at the end she read, "Position in class next term, third." "Splendid, Eddy!" she exclaimed. "I thought you were second," said Clara, in her sharp manner. Edwin blushed again and hesitated. "Eh? Was that?" his father demanded. "I didn't notice that. Third?" "Charlie Orgreave beat me in the examination," Edwin muttered. "Well, that's a pretty howdy-do," said his father. "Going down one, you ought to have been first instead of third. And would have been, happen, if you'd pegged at it." "Now I won't have that. I won't have it," Auntie Clara protested, laughingly showing her fine teeth and gazing first at Darius and then at Edwin from under her spectacles, her head being thrown back and the curls hanging far behind. No one shall say that Edwin doesn't work, not even his father while his auntie's about, because I know he does work. And besides, he hasn't gone down. It says position next term, not this term. You were still second to day, weren't you, my boy?" "I suppose so. Yes," Edwin answered, pulling himself together. "Well, there you are." Auntie Clara's voice rang triumphantly. She was opening her purse. "And there you are," she repeated, popping half a sovereign down in front of him. "That's a little present from your auntie on your leaving school." "Oh, auntie!" he cried feebly. "Oh!" cried Clara, genuinely startled. Mrs Hamps was sometimes thus astoundingly munificent. It was she who had given the schooner to Edwin, and her presents of elaborately enveloped and costly toilet soap on the birthdays of the children and at Christmas were massive. Yet Clara always maintained that she was the meanest old thing imaginable. And Maggie had once said that she knew that Auntie Clara made her servant eat dripping instead of butter. To give inferior food to a servant was to Maggie the unforgivable in parsimony. "Well," Mr Clayhanger warningly inquired, "what do you say to your aunt?" "Thank you, auntie," Edwin sheepishly responded, fingering the coin. It was a princely sum, and she had stuck up for him famously in the matter of the report. Strange that his father should not have read the report with sufficient attention to remark the fall to third place. Anyway, that aspect of the affair was now safely over, and it seemed to him that he had not lost much prestige by it. He would still be able to argue with his father on terms not too unequal, he hoped. 5. As the tea drew to an end, and the plates of toast, bread and butter and tea cake grew emptier, and the slop basin filled, and only Maggie's flowers remained fresh and immaculate amid the untidy debris of the meal, and as Edwin and Clara became gradually indifferent to jam, and then inimical to it, and as the sounds of the street took on the softer quality of summer evening, and the first filmy shades of twilight gathered imperceptibly in the corners of the room, and Mr Clayhanger performed the eructations which signified that he had had enough, so Mrs Hamps prepared herself for one of her classic outbursts of feeling. "Well," she said at last, putting her spoon to the left of her cup as a final indication that seriously she would drink no more. And she gave a great sigh. School over, and the only son going out into the world. How time flies! And she gave another great sigh, implying an immense melancholy due to this vision of the reality of things. Then she remembered her courage, and the device of leaning hard, and all her philosophy. "But it's all for the best," she broke forth in a new brave tone. "Everything is ordered for the best. We must never forget that. And I'm quite sure that Edwin will be a very great credit to us all, with help from above." She proceeded powerfully in this strain. She brought in God, Christ, and even the Holy Spirit. She mentioned the dangers of the world, and the disguises of the devil, and the unspeakable advantages of a good home, and the special goodness of Mr Clayhanger, and of Maggie, yes, and of her little Clara, and the pride which they all had in Edwin, and the unique opportunities which he had of doing good by example, and also soon by precept, for others younger than himself would begin to look up to him, and again her personal pride in him, and her sure faith in him, and what a solemn hour it was. Nothing could stop her. The girls loathed these exhibitions. Maggie always looked at the table during their progress, and she felt as though she had done something wrong and was ashamed of it. Clara not merely felt like a criminal, she felt like an unrepentant criminal. She blushed, she glanced nervously about the room, and all the time she repeated steadily in her heart a highly obscene word which she had heard at school. This unspoken word, hurled soundlessly but savagely at her aunt in that innocent heart, afforded much comfort to Clara in the affliction. Even Edward, who was more lenient in all ways than his sisters, profoundly deplored these moralisings of his aunt. They filled him with a desire to run fast and far, to be alone at sea, or to be deep somewhere in the bosom of the earth. He could not understand this side of his auntie's individuality. But there was no delivery from Mrs Hamps. The only person who could possibly have delivered them seemed to enjoy the sinister thraldom. Mr Clayhanger listened with appreciative and admiring nods. He appeared to be quite sincere. And Edwin could not understand his father either. How simple father must be, he thought vaguely. Whereas Clara fatalistically dismissed her father's attitude as only one more of the preposterously unreasonable phenomena which she was constantly meeting in life. And she persevered grimly with her obscene word. SIX. "Eh!" said Mrs Hamps enthusiastically, after a trifling pause. "It does me good when I think what a help you'll be to your father in the business, with that clever head of yours." She gazed at him fondly. Now this was Edwin's chance. He did not wish to be any help at all to his father in the business. He had other plans for himself. He had never mentioned them before, because his father had never talked to him about his future career, apparently assuming that he would go into the business. He had been waiting for his father to begin. "Surely," he had said to himself, "father's bound to speak to me some time about what I'm going to do. And when he does I shall just tell him." But his father never had begun, and by timidity, negligence, and perhaps ill luck, Edwin had thus arrived at his last day at school with the supreme question not merely unsolved, but unattacked. Oh, he blamed himself. Any ordinary boy, he thought, would have discussed such a question naturally long ago. After all, it was not a crime, it was no cause for shame, to wish not to be a printer. Yet he was ashamed. Absurd! He blamed himself, but he also blamed his father. Now, however, in responding to his auntie's remark, he could remedy all the past by simply and boldly stating that he did not want to follow his father. It would be unpleasant, of course, but the worst shock would be over in a moment, like the drawing of a tooth. He had merely to utter certain words. He must utter them. They were perfectly easy to say, and they were also of the greatest urgency. "I don't want to be a printer." He mumbled them over in his mind. "I don't want to be a printer." What could it matter to his father whether he was a printer or not? Seconds, minutes seemed to pass. He knew that if he was so inconceivably craven as to remain silent, his self-respect would never recover from the blow. Then, in response to Mrs Hamps's prediction about his usefulness to his father in the business, he said, with a false, jaunty, unconvincing air, "Well, that remains to be seen." This was all he could accomplish. It seemed as if he had looked death itself in the face and drawn away. "Remains to be seen?" Auntie Clara repeated, with a hint of startled pain, due to this levity. He was mute. No one suspected, as he sat there so boyish, wistful, and uneasily squirming, that he was agonised to the very centre of his being. All the time, in his sweating soul, he kept trying to persuade himself, "I've given them a hint anyhow. I've given them a hint anyhow." Them included everybody at the table. SEVEN. Mr Clayhanger, completely ignoring Edwin's reply to his aunt, and her somewhat shocked repetition of it, turned suddenly towards his son and said, in a manner friendly but serious, a manner that assumed everything, a manner that begged the question, unconscious even that there was a question, "I shall be out the better part of to morrow. I want you to be sure to be in the shop all afternoon. I'll tell you what for downstairs." It was characteristic of him thus to make a mystery of business in front of the women. Edwin felt the net closing about him. Then he thought of one of those poses which often present themselves to youths of his age. "But to-morrow's Saturday," he said, perhaps perkily. "What about the Bible class?" 6 months previously a young minister of the Wesleyan circuit, to whom heaven had denied both a sense of humour and a sense of honour, had committed the infamy of starting a Bible class for big boys on Saturday afternoons. This outrage had appalled and disgusted the boyhood of Wesleyism in Bursley. Their afternoon for games! their only fair afternoon in the desert of the week, to be filched from them and used against them for such an odious purpose as a Bible class. Not only Sunday school on Sunday afternoon, but a Bible class on Saturday afternoon! It was incredible! It was unbearable! It was gross tyranny, and nothing else. Nevertheless, the young minister had his way, by dint of meanly calling upon parents and invoking their help. The scurvy worm actually got together a class of 12 to 15 boys, to the end of securing their eternal welfare. And they had to attend the class, though they swore they never would. And they had to sing hymns, and they had to kneel and listen to prayers, and they had to listen to the most intolerable tedium, and to take notes of it. All this while the sun was shining, or the rain was raining, on fields and streets and open spaces and ponds. Edwin had been trapped in the snare. His father, after only 3 words from the young minister, had yielded up his son like a burnt sacrifice, and with a casual nonchalance that utterly confounded Edwin. In vain Edwin had pointed out to his elders that a Saturday afternoon of confinement must be bad for his health. His attention had been directed to his eternal health. In vain he had pointed out that on wet Saturday afternoons he frequently worked at his home lessons, which therefore might suffer under the regime of a Bible class. His attention had been directed to the peace which passeth understanding. So he had been beaten, and was secretly twitted by Clara as an abject victim. Hence it was with a keen and peculiar feeling of triumph, of hopelessly cornering the inscrutable generation which a few months ago had cornered him, that he demanded, perhaps perkily, "What about the Bible class?" "There'll be no more Bible classing," said his father, with a mild but slightly sardonic smile, as who should say, "I'm ready to make all allowances for youth, but I must get you to understand, as gently as I can, that you can't keep going to Bible classes for ever and ever." Mrs Hamps said, "It won't be as if you were at school, but I do hope you won't neglect to study your Bible. But I do hope you'll always find time for that, to your dying day." "Oh, but I say," Edwin began, and stopped. He was beaten by the mere effrontery of the replies. His father and his aunt, the latter of whom at any rate was a firm and confessed religionist, who had been responsible for converting Mr Clayhanger from Primitive Methodism to Wesleyan Methodism, did not trouble to defend their new position by argument. They made no effort to reconcile it with their position of a few months back, when the importance of heavenly welfare far exceeded the importance of any conceivable earthly welfare. The fact was that they had no argument. If God took precedence of knowledge and of health, he took precedence of a peddling shop. That was unanswerable. 8. Edwin was dashed. His faith in humanity was dashed. These elders were not sincere. And as Mrs Hamps continued to embroider the original theme of her exhortation about the Bible, Edwin looked at her stealthily, and the doubt crossed his mind whether that majestic and vital woman was ever sincere about anything, even to herself; whether the whole of her daily existence, from her getting up to her down lying, was not a grandiose pretence. Not that he had the least desire to cling to the Bible class, even as an alternative to the shop. No, he was much relieved to be rid of the Bible class. What overset him was the crude illogicality of the new decree, and the shameless tacit admission of previous insincerity. 2 hours later, as he stood idly at the window of his bedroom, watching the gas lamps of Trafalgar Road wax brighter in the last glooms of twilight, he was still occupied with the sham and the unreason and the lack of scruple suddenly revealed in the life of the elder generation. Unconsciously imitating a trick of his father's when annoyed but calm, he nodded his head several times, and with his tongue against his teeth made the noise which in writing is represented by _tsk tsk. Yet somehow he had always known that it would be so. At bottom he was only pretending to himself to be shocked and outraged. His plans were no further advanced. Indeed, they were put back, for this Saturday afternoon vigil in the shop would be in some sort a symbolic temporary defeat for him. Why had he not spoken out clearly? Why was he always like a baby in presence of his father? The future was all askew for him. He had forgotten his tremendous serious resolves. The touch of the half sovereign in his pocket, however, was comforting in a universe of discomfort. Volume 1, Chapter 7.
Chapter 8 of Clayhanger by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. In the shop. "Here, lad," said his father to Edwin, as soon as he had scraped up the last crumbs of cheese from his plate at the end of dinner on the following day. Edwin rose obediently and followed him out of the room. Having waited at the top of the stairs until his father had reached the foot, he leaned forward as far as he could, with one hand on the rail and the other pressing against the wall, swooped down to the mat at the bottom without touching a single step on the way, and made a rocket-like noise with his mouth. He had no other manner of descending the staircase, unless he happened to be in disgrace. His father went straight to the desk in the corner behind the account book window, assumed his spectacles, and lifted the lid of the desk. "Here," he said in a low voice. "Mr Enoch Peake is stepping in this afternoon to look at this here." He displayed the proof, an unusually elaborate wedding card, which announced the marriage of Mr Enoch Peake with Mrs Louisa Loggerheads. "You know him as I mean?" "Yes," said Edwin. "The stout man. The Cocknage Gardens man." "That's him. Well, you'll tell him I've been called away. Tell him who ye are. Not but what he'll know. Tell him I think it might be better," Darius's thick finger ran along a line of print, "if we put `widow of the late Simon Loggerheads, Esquire,' instead of `Esq.' See? Otherwise it's all right. Tell him, I say, as otherwise it's all right. And ask him if he'll have it printed in silver, and how many he wants, and show him this sample envelope. Now d'ye understand?" "Yes," said Edwin, in a tone to convey, not disrespectfully, that there was nothing to understand. Curious how his father had the air of bracing all his intellect as if to a problem. "Then you'll take it to Big James, and he can start Chawner on it. The job's promised for Monday afternoon." "Will Big James be working?" asked Edwin, for it was Saturday afternoon, when, though the shop remained open, the printing office was closed. "They're all on overtime," said Mr Clayhanger. And then he added, in a voice still lower, and with a surreptitious glance at Miss Ingamells, the shopwoman, who was stolidly enfolding newspapers in wrappers at the opposite counter, "See to it yourself, now. He won't want to talk to her about a thing like that. Tell him I told you specially. Just let me see how well you can do it." "Right," said Edwin. And to himself, superciliously, it might be life or death. "We ought to be doing a lot of business with Enoch Peake later on," Mr Clayhanger finished in a whisper. "I see," said Edwin, impressed, perceiving that he had perhaps been supercilious too soon. Mr Clayhanger returned his spectacles to their case, and taking his hat from its customary hook behind him over the job files, consulted his watch and passed round the counter to go. Then he stopped. "I'm going to Manchester," he murmured confidentially, "to see if I can pick up a machine as I've heard of." Edwin was flattered. At the dinner table Mr Clayhanger had only vouchsafed that he had a train to catch, and would probably not be in till late at night. The next moment he glimpsed Darius through the window, his arms motionless by his sides and sticking slightly out, hurrying in the sunshine along Wedgwood Street in the direction of Shawport Station. TWO. So this was business! It was not the business he desired and meant to have, and he was uneasy at the extent to which he was already entangled in it. But it was rather amusing, and his father had really been very friendly. He felt a sense of importance. Soon afterwards Clara ran into the shop to speak to Miss Ingamells. The two chatted and giggled together. "Father's gone to Manchester," he found opportunity to say to Clara as she was leaving. "Why aren't you doing those prizes he told you to do?" retorted Clara, and vanished. She wanted none of Edwin's superior airs. During dinner Mr Clayhanger had instructed his son to go through the Sunday school prize stock and make an inventory of it. This injunction from the child Clara, which Miss Ingamells had certainly overheard, prevented him, as an independent man, from beginning his work for at least 10 minutes. He whistled, opened his father's desk, and stared vacantly into it, examined the pen nib case in detail, and tore off 2 leaves from the date calendar so that it should be ready for Monday. He had a great scorn for Miss Ingamells, who was a personable if somewhat heavy creature of 28, because she kept company with a young man. He had caught them arm in arm and practically hugging each other one Sunday afternoon in the street. He could see naught but silliness in that kind of thing. The entrance of a customer caused him to turn abruptly to the high shelves where the books were kept. He was glad that the customer was not Mr Enoch Peake, the expectation of whose arrival made him curiously nervous. He placed the step-ladder against the shelves, climbed up, and began to finger volumes and parcels of volumes. The dust was incredible. The disorder filled him with contempt. It was astounding that his father could tolerate such disorder. No doubt the whole shop was in the same condition. 13 Archie's old desk, he read on a parcel, but when he opened the parcel he found 7 from jest to earnest. Hence he had to undo every parcel. However, the work was easy. He first wrote the inventory in pencil, then he copied it in ink, then he folded it, and wrote very carefully on the back, because his father had a mania for endorsing documents in the legal manner: "Inventory of Sunday school prize stock." And after an instant's hesitation he added his own initials. Then he began to tie up and restore the parcels and the single volumes. None of all this literature had any charm for him. He possessed 5 or 6 such books, all gilt and chromatic, which had been awarded to him at Sunday school, suitably inscribed, for doing nothing in particular, and he regarded them without exception as frauds upon boyhood. However, Clara had always enjoyed reading them. But lying flat on one of the top shelves he discovered, nearly at the end of his task, an oblong tome which did interest him: Casanova's Architectural Views of European Capitals, with descriptive letterpress. It had an old-fashioned look, and was probably some relic of his father's predecessor in the establishment. Another example of the lack of order which prevailed. 3. He took the volume to the retreat of the desk, and there turned over its pages of coloured illustrations. At first his interest in them, and in the letterpress, was less instinctive than deliberate. He said to himself: "Now if there is anything in me, I ought really to be interested in this, and I must be interested in it." And he was. He glanced carelessly at the clock, which was hung above the shelves of exercise books and notebooks exactly opposite the door. 4:15. The afternoon was quietly passing, and he had not found it too tedious. In the background of the task, which, he considered, he had accomplished with extraordinary efficiency, his senses noted faintly the continual trickle of customers, all of whom were infallibly drawn to Miss Ingamells's counter by her mere watchful and receptive appearance. He had heard phrases and ends of phrases, such as: "No, we haven't anything smaller." "A camel hair brush." "Gum, but not glue." "Very sorry, sir. I'll speak firmly to the paper boy." And the sound of coins dragged along the counter, the sound of the testing of half a sovereign, the opening and shutting of the till drawer, and occasionally Miss Ingamells exclaiming to herself upon the stupidity of customers after a customer had gone. And once Miss Ingamells crossing angrily to fix the door ajar which some heedless customer had closed. Did they suppose that people didn't want air like other people? And now it was 4:15. Undoubtedly he had a peculiar and pleasant feeling of importance. In another half minute he glanced at the clock again, and it was 5:15. What hypnotism attracted him towards the artist's materials cabinet, which stood magnificent, complicated, and complete in the middle of the shop, like a monument? His father, after one infantile disastrous raid, had absolutely forbidden any visitation of that cabinet, with its glass case of assorted paints, crayons, brushes, and pencils, and its innumerable long drawers full of paper and cards and wondrous perfectly equipped boxes, and T-squares and set squares, with 100 other contrivances. But of course the order had now ceased to have force. Edwin had left school, and if he was not a man, he was certainly not a boy. He began to open the drawers, at first gingerly, then boldly. After all, it was no business of Miss Ingamells's. And to be just, Miss Ingamells made no sort of pretence that it was any business of hers. She proceeded with her own business. Edwin opened a rather large wooden water colour box. It was marked 5 and 6pence. It seemed to comprise everything needed for the production of the most entrancing and majestic architectural views. And as Edwin took out its upper case and discovered still further marvellous devices and apparatus in its basement beneath, he dimly but passionately saw in his heart bright masterpieces that ought to be the fruit of that box. There was a key to it. He must have it. He would have given all that he possessed for it, if necessary. FOUR. "Miss Ingamells," he said, and as she did not look up immediately, "I say, Miss Ingamells, how much does father take off in the shilling to auntie when she buys anything?" "Don't ask me, Master Edwin," said Miss Ingamells. "I don't know. How should I know?" "Well, then," he muttered, "I shall pay full price for it, that's all." He could not wait, and he wanted to be on the safe side. Miss Ingamells gave him change for his half sovereign in a strictly impartial manner, to indicate that she accepted no responsibility. And the squaring of Edwin's shoulders conveyed to Miss Ingamells that he advised her to keep carefully within her own sphere, and not to make impertinent inquiries about the origin of the half sovereign, which he could see intrigued her acutely. He now owned the box. It was not a box of colours, but a box of enchantment. He had had colour boxes before, but nothing to compare with this, nothing that could have seemed magical to anybody wiser than a very small boy. Then he bought some cartridge paper. He considered that cartridge paper would be good enough for preliminary experiments. FIVE. It was while he was paying for the cartridge paper, he being, as was indeed proper, on the customer's side of the counter, that a heavy loutish boy in an apron entered the shop, blushing. Edwin turned away. This was Miss Ingamells's affair. "If you please, Mester Peake sent me. He canna come in this afternoon. He's got a bit o' ratting on. And will Mester Clayhanger step across to the Dragon to night after 8, with that there paper, as he knows on?" At the name of Peake, Edwin started. He had utterly forgotten the matter. "Master Edwin," said Miss Ingamells dryly, "you know all about that." "Don't you?" Clearly she resented that he knew all about that while she didn't. "Oh yes," Edwin stammered. "What did you say?" It was his first piece of real business. "If you please, Mester Peake sent me." The messenger blundered through his message again, word for word. "Very well, I'll attend to it," said Edwin, as nonchalantly as he could. Nevertheless he was at a loss what to do, simple though the situation might have seemed to a person with an experience of business longer than Edwin's. Just as 3 hours previously his father had appeared to be bracing all his intellect to a problem that struck Edwin as entirely simple, so now Edwin seemed to be bracing all his intellect to another aspect of the same problem. Time, revenging his father. What? Go across to the Dragon and in cold blood demand Mr Enoch Peake? And then parley with Mr Enoch Peake as one man with another? He had never been inside the Dragon. He had been brought up in the belief that the Dragon was a place of sin. The Dragon was included in the generic term `gin palace,' and quite probably in the Siamese twin term `gaming saloon.' Moreover, to discuss business with Mr Enoch Peake... Mr Enoch Peake was as mysterious to Edwin as, say, a Chinese mandarin. Still, business was business, and something would have to be done. He did not know what. Ought he to go to the Dragon? His father had not foreseen the possibility of this development. He instantly decided one fundamental: he would not consult Miss Ingamells. No, nor even Maggie. There remained only Big James. He went across to see Big James, who was calmly smoking a pipe on the little landing at the top of the steps leading to the printing office. Big James showed no astonishment. "You come along o' me to the Dragon to night, young sir, at 8 o'clock, or as soon after as makes no matter, and I'll see as you see Mr Enoch Peake. I shall be coming up Woodisun Bank at 8 o'clock, or as soon after as makes no matter. You be waiting for me at the back gates there, and I'll see as you see Mr Enoch Peake. Are you going to the Dragon?" "Am I going to the Dragon, young sir?" exclaimed Big James in his majestic voice. CHAPTER 9, of Clayhanger, by Arnold Bennett. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. The Town. James Yarlett was worthy of his nickname. He stood 6 feet 4.5 inches in height, and his girth was proportionate. He had enormous hands and feet, large features, and a magnificent long dark brown beard. Owing to this beard his necktie was never seen. But the most magnificent thing about him was his bass voice, acknowledged to be the finest bass in the town, and one of the finest even in Hanbridge, where in his earlier prime James had lived as a news comp on the Staffordshire Signal. He was now a jobbing comp in Bursley, because Bursley was his native town, and because he preferred jobbing. He made the fourth and heaviest member of the celebrated Bursley male glee party, the other three being Arthur Smallrice, an old man with a striking falsetto voice, Abraham Harracles, and Jos Ranpick. These men were accustomed to fame, and Big James was the king of them, though the mildest. They sang at dinners, free and easies, concerts, and Martinmas tea meetings. They sang for the glory, and when there was no demand for their services, they sang to themselves for the sake of singing. Each of them was a star in some church or chapel choir, and, except Arthur Smallrice, they all shared a certain elasticity of religious opinion. Big James, for example, had varied in 10 years from Wesleyan through Old Church to Roman Catholic up at Bleakridge. It all depended on niceties in the treatment accorded to him, and on the choice of anthems. Moreover, he liked a change. He was what his superiors called a very superior man. Owing to the more careful enunciation required in singing, he had lost a great deal of the Five Towns accent, and one cannot be a compositor for a quarter of a century without insensibly acquiring an education and a store of knowledge far excelling the ordinary. His manner was gentle, and perhaps somewhat pompous, as is common with very big men, but you could never be sure whether an extremely subdued humour did not underlie his pomposity. He was a bachelor, aged 45, and lived quietly with a married sister at the bottom of Woodisun Bank, near the National Schools. The wonder was that with all his advantages he had not more deeply impressed himself upon Bursley as an individuality, and not merely as a voice. But he seemed never to seek to do so. He was without ambition, and though curiously careful sometimes about preserving his own dignity, and beyond question sensitive by temperament, he showed marked respect and even humility to the worldly successful. Despite his bigness and simplicity, there was something small about him which came out in odd trifling details. Thus it was characteristic of Big James to ask Edwin to be waiting for him at the back gates in Woodisun Bank, when he might just as easily have met him at the side door by the closed shop in Wedgwood Street. Edwin, who from mere pride had said nothing to his sisters about the impending visit to the Dragon, was a little surprised and dashed to see Big James in broadcloth and a high hat, for he had not dreamed of changing his own everyday suit, nor had it occurred to him that the Dragon was a temple of ceremoniousness. Big James looked enormous. The wide lapel of his shining frock coat was buttoned high up under his beard, and curved downwards for a distance of considerably more than a yard to his knees. It was a heroic frock coat. The sleeves were wide, but narrowing at the wrists, and the white wristbands were very tight. The trousers fell in ample folds on the uppers of the gigantic boots. Big James had a way of sticking out his chest and throwing his head back which would have projected the tip of his beard 10 inches forth from his body, had the beard been stiff, but the soft silkiness of the beard frustrated this spectacular phenomenon, which would have been very interesting to witness.
2. The pair stepped across Trafalgar Road together. Edwin, though he tried to be sedate, nothing but a frisking morsel by the side of the vast monument. Compared with the architectural grandeur of Mr Varlett, his thin, supple, free-moving limbs had an almost pathetic appearance of ephemeral fragility. Big James directed himself to the archway leading to the Dragon stables, and there he saw an ostler or odd man. Edwin, feeling the imminence of an ordeal, surreptitiously explored a pocket to be sure that the proof of the wedding card was safely there. The ostler raised his reddish eyebrows to Big James. Big James jerked his head to one side, indicating apparently the entire Dragon, and simultaneously conveying a query. The ostler paused, immobile an instant, and then shook his insignificant turnip pate. Big James turned away. No word had been spoken. Nevertheless, the men had exchanged a dialogue which might be thus put into words. "I wasn't thinking to see you so soon," from the ostler. "Then nobody of any importance has yet gone into the assembly room?" from Big James. "Nobody worth speaking of, and won't for a while," from the other. "Then I'll take a turn," from Big James. The latter now looked down at Edwin and addressed him in words. "Seemingly we're too soon, Mr Edwin. What do you say to a turn round the town, playground way?" "I doubted we should be too soon." Edwin showed alacrity. As a schoolboy it had been definitely forbidden to him to go out at night, and unless sent on a special and hurried errand, he had scarcely seen the physiognomy of the streets after 8 o'clock. He had never seen the playground in the evening. And this evening the town did not seem like the same town. It had become a new and mysterious town of adventure. And yet Edwin was not 50 yards away from his own bedroom. They ascended Duck Bank together. Edwin proud to be with a celebrity of the calibre of Big James, and Big James calmly satisfied to show himself thus formally with his master's son. It appeared almost incredible that those two immortals, so diverse, had issued from the womb practically alike, that a few brief years on the earth had given Big James such a tremendous physical advantage. Several hours' daily submission to the exact regularities of lines of type, and to the unvarying demands of minutely adjusted machines in motion, had stamped Big James's body and mind with the delicate and quasi-finicking preciseness which characterises all compositors and printers, and the continual monotonous performance of similar tasks that employed his faculties while never absorbing or straining them, had soothed and dulled the fever of life in him to a beneficent calm, a calm refined and beautified by the pleasurable exercise of song. Big James had seldom known a violent emotion. He had craved nothing, sought for nothing, and lost nothing. Edwin, like Big James in progress from everlasting to everlasting, was all inchoate, unformed, undisciplined, and burning with capricious fires, all expectant, eager, reluctant, tingling, timid, innocently and wistfully audacious. By taking the boy's hand, Big James might have poetically symbolised their relation. 3. "Are you going to sing to night at the Dragon, Mr Yarlett?" asked Edwin. He lengthened his step to Big James, controlled his ardent body, and tried to remember that he was a man with a man. "I am, young sir," said Big James. "There is a party of us." "Is it the male glee party?" Edwin pursued. "Yes, Mr Edwin." "Then Mr Smallrice will be there." "He will, Mr Edwin." "Why can Mr Smallrice sing such high notes?" Big James slowly shook his head as Edwin looked up at him. "I tell you what it is, young sir, it's a gift, that's what it is. Same as I can sing low." "But Mr Smallrice is very old, isn't he?" "There's a parrot in a cage over at the Duck there as is 85 years old. And that's proved by record kept, young sir." "No!" protested Edwin's incredulity politely. "By record kept," said Big James. "Do you often sing at the Dragon, Mr Yarlett?" "Time was," said Big James, "when some of us used to sing there every night, Sundays excepted, and concerts and what not excepted." Aye, for hours and hours every night, and still do sometimes." "After your work?" "After our work, aye. And often till dawn in summer. 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 2:30 every night. But now they say that this new Licensing Act will close every public house in this town at 11 o'clock, and a straight up 11 at that." "But what do you do it for?" "What do we do it for? We do it to pass the time and the glass, young sir. Not as I should like you to think as I ever drank, Mr Edwin. 1 quart of ale I take every night, and have ever done. No more, no less." "But," Edwin's rapid breaking voice interrupted eagerly the deep majestic tones, "aren't you tired the next day? I should be." "Never!" said Big James. "I get up from my bed as fresh as a daisy at 6 sharp, and I've known the nights when my bed ne'er saw me." "You must be strong, Mr Yarlett, my word!" Edwin exclaimed. These revelations of the habits and prowess of Big James astounded him. He had never suspected that such things went on in the town. "Aye, middling. I suppose it's a free and easy at the Dragon to night, Mr Yarlett?" "In a manner of speaking," said Big James. "I wish I could stay for it." "And why not?" Big James suggested, and looked down at Edwin with half humorous incertitude. Edwin shrugged his shoulders superiorly, indicating by instinct, in spite of himself, that possibly Big James was trespassing over the social line that divided them. And yet Big James's father would have condescended to Edwin's grandfather. Only Edwin now belonged to the employing class, whilst Big James belonged to the employed. Already Edwin, whose father had been thrashed by workmen whom a compositor would hesitate to call skilled, already Edwin had the mien natural to a ruler, and Big James, with dignified deference, would submit unresentingly to his attitude. It was the subtlest thing. It was not that Edwin obscurely objected to the suggestion of his being present at the free and easy. It was that he objected, but nicely and with good nature, to any assumption of Big James's right to influence him towards an act that his father would not approve. Instead of saying "Why not?" Big James ought to have said, "Nobody but you can decide that, as your father's away." James ought to have been strictly impartial. FOUR. "Well," said Big James, when they arrived at the playground, which lay north of the covered meat market or shambles, "it looks as if they haven't been able to make a start yet at the Blood Tub." His tone was marked by a calm grand disdain, as of one entertainer talking about another. The Blood Tub, otherwise known as Snaggs', was the centre of nocturnal pleasure in Bursley. It stood almost on the very spot where the jawbone of a whale had once lain, as a supreme natural curiosity. It represented the softened manners which had developed out of the old medievalism of the century. It had supplanted the bear pit and the cockpit. It corresponded somewhat with the ideals symbolised by the new town hall. In the tiny odorous beer houses of all the undulating, twisting, reddish streets that surrounded the contiguous open spaces of Duck Bank, the playground, the market place, and St Luke's Square, the folk no longer discussed eagerly what chance on Sunday morning the municipal bear would have against 5 dogs. They had progressed as far as a free library, boxing gloves, rabbit coursing, and the Blood Tub. This last was a theatre with wooden sides and a canvas roof, and it would hold quite a crowd of people. In front of it was a platform and an orchestra, lighted by oil flares that, as Big James and Edwin approached, were gaining strength in the twilight. Leaning against the platform was a blackboard on which was chalked the announcement of 2 plays: The 40 Thieves, author unstated, and Crookshanks the Bottle. The orchestra, after terrific concussions, fell silent, and then a troupe of players in costume, cramped on the narrow trestle boards, performed a sample scene from the 40 Thieves, just to give the crowd in front an idea of the wonders of this powerful work. And 4 thieves passed and repassed behind the screen hiding the doors, and reappeared 9 times as 4 fresh thieves, until the tale of 40 was complete. And then old Hammerad, the beloved clown who played the drum, and whose wife kept a barber's shop in Buck Row and shaved for a penny, left his drum and did 2 minutes' stiff clowning, and then the orchestra burst forth again, and the brazen voice of old Snaggs, in his moleskin waistcoat, easily rode the storm, adjuring the folk to walk up, which some of the folk did do. And lastly the band played God Save the Queen, and the players, followed by old Snaggs, processionally entered the booth. "I lay they come out again," said Big James, with grim blandness. "Why?" asked Edwin. He was absolutely new to the scene. "I lay they haven't got 20 couple inside," said Big James. And in less than a minute the troupe did indeed emerge, and old Snaggs expostulated with the dilatory public, respectfully but firmly. It had been a queer year for Mr Snaggs. Rain had ruined the Wakes. Rain had ruined everything. Rain had nearly ruined him. July was obviously not a month in which a self-respecting theatre ought to be open, but Mr Snaggs had got to the point of catching at straws. He stated that in order to prove his absolute bona fides, the troupe would now give a scene from that world-renowned and unique drama, The Bottle, after which the performance really would commence, since he could not as a gentleman keep his kind patrons within waiting any longer. His habit, which emphasised itself as he grew older, was to treat the staring crowd in front of his booth like a family of nephews and nieces. The device was quite useless, for the public's stolidity was impregnable. It touched the heroic. No more granitic and crass stolidity could have been discovered in England. The crowd stood. It exercised no other function of existence. It just stood, and there it would stand until convinced that the gratis part of the spectacle was positively at an end. V. With a ceremonious gesture signifying that he assumed the young sir's consent, Big James turned away. He had displayed to Edwin the poverty and the futility of the blood tub. Edwin would perhaps have liked to stay. The scenes enacted on the outer platform were certainly tinged with the ridiculous, but they were the first histrionics that he had ever witnessed, and he could not help thinking, hoping, in spite of his common sense, that within the booth all was different, miraculously transformed into the grand and the impressive. Left to himself, he would surely have preferred an evening at the Blood Tub to a business interview with Mr Enoch Peake at the Dragon. But naturally he had to scorn the Blood Tub with a scorn equal to the massive and silent scorn of Big James. And on the whole he considered that he was behaving as a man with another man rather well. He sought by depreciatory remarks to keep the conversation at its proper adult level. Big James led him through the market-place, where a few vegetable, tripe, and gingerbread stalls, relics of the day's market, were still attracting customers in the twilight. These slatternly and picturesque groups, beneath their flickering yellow flares, were encamped at the gigantic foot of the Town Hall porch, as at the foot of a precipice. The monstrous black walls of the Town Hall rose and were merged in gloom, and the spire of the Town Hall, on whose summit stood a gold angel holding a gold crown, rose right into the heavens and was there lost. It was marvellous that this town, by adding stone to stone, had upreared this monument, which in expressing the secret nobility of its ideals dwarfed the town. On every side of it the beer-houses, full of a dulled, savage ecstasy of life, gleamed brighter than the shops. Big James led Edwin down through the mysteries of the Cock Yard and up along Bugg's Gutter, and so back to the Dragon. End of Chapter 9, Volume 1.
Chapter 10 of Clayhanger by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. Free and Easy. When Edwin shyly followed Big James into the assembly room of the Dragon, it already held a fair sprinkling of men, and newcomers continued to drop in. They were soberly and respectably clothed, though a few had knotted handkerchiefs round their necks instead of collars and ties. The occasion was a jollity of the Bursley Mutual Burial Club. This club, a singular example of that dogged private co-operative enterprise which so sharply distinguishes English corporate life from the corporate life of other European countries, had lustily survived from a period when men were far less sure of a decent burial than they were then in the very prosperous early seventies. It had helped to maintain the barbaric fashion of ostentatiously expensive funerals, out of which undertakers and beer sellers made vast sums, but it had also provided a basis of common endeavour and of fellowship, and its respectability was intense and at the same time broad-minded. To be an established subscriber to the Burial Club was evidence of good character and of social spirit. The periodic jollities of this company of men, whose professed aim was to bury each other, had a high reputation for excellence. Up till a year previously they had always been held at the Duck, in Duck Square opposite. But Mr Enoch Peake, chairman of the club, had by persistent and relentless chicane, triumphing over immense influences, changed their venue to the Dragon, whose landlady, Mrs Louisa Loggerheads, he was then courting. It must be stated that Mrs Louisa's name contained no slur of cantankerousness. It is merely the local word for a harmless plant, the knapweed. He had now won Mrs Loggerheads after being a widower thrice, and with her the second best house in the town. There were long benches down the room, with forms on either side of them. Big James, not without pomp, escorted a blushing Edwin to the end of one of these tables, near a small raised platform that occupied the extremity of the room. Over this platform was printed a legend, "As a bird is known by its note," and over the legend was a full-rigged ship in a glass case and a pair of antlers. The walls of the room were dark brown, the ceiling grey with soot of various sorts, and the floor tiled red and black and sanded. Smoke rose in spirals from about a score of churchwarden pipes and as many cutties, which were charged from tin pouches and lighted by spools of newspaper from the 3 double gas jets that hung down over the benches. 2 middle-aged women, one in black and the other checked, served beer, porter, and stout in mugs, and gin in glasses, passing in and out through a side door. The company talked little, and it had not yet begun seriously to drink, but sprawled about in attitudes of restful abeyance, it was smoking religiously, and the flat noise of solemn expectorations punctuated the minutes. Edwin was easily the youngest person present. The average age appeared to be about 50, but nobody's curiosity seemed to be much stirred by his odd arrival, and he ceased gradually to blush. When, however, one of the women paused before him in silent question, and he had to explain that he required no drink because he had only called for a moment about a matter of business, he blushed again vigorously. TWO. Then Mr Enoch Peake appeared. He was a short, stout old man with fat hands, a red, minutely wrinkled face, and very small eyes. Greeted with the respect due to the owner of Cocknage Gardens, a sporting resort where all the best foot racing and rabbit coursing took place, he accepted it in somnolent indifference, and immediately took off his coat and sat down in cotton shirt sleeves. Then he pulled out a red handkerchief and his tobacco box and set them on the table. Big James motioned to Edwin. "Evening, Mr Peake," said Big James, crossing the floor. "And here's a young gent wishful for 2 words with you." Mr Peake stared vacantly. "Young Mr Clayhanger," explained Big James. "It's about this card," Edwin began in a whisper, drawing the wedding card sheepishly from his pocket. "Father had to go to Manchester," he added, when he had finished. Mr Enoch Peake seized the card in both hands and examined it, and Edwin could hear his heavy breathing. Mrs Louisa Loggerheads, a comfortable, smiling, administrative woman of 50, showed herself at the service door and nodded with dignity to a few of the habitues. "Missus is at door," said Big James to Mr Peake. "Is her," muttered Mr Peake, not interrupting his examination of the card. One of the serving women, having removed Mr Peake's coat, brought a new churchwarden, filled it, and carefully directed the tip towards his tight little mouth. The lips closed on it. Then she lighted a spill and applied it to the distant bowl, and the mouth puffed, and then the woman deposited the bowl cautiously on the bench. Lastly she came with a small glass of sloe gin. Mr Peake did not move. At length Mr Peake withdrew the pipe from his mouth, and after an interval said, "Aye." He continued to stare at the card, now held in one hand. "And is it to be printed in silver?" Edwin asked. Mr Peake took a few more puffs. "Aye." When he had stared further for a long time at the card, his hand moved slowly with it towards Edwin, and Edwin resumed possession of it. Mrs Louisa Loggerheads had now vanished. "Missus has gone," said Big James. "Has her?" muttered Mr Peake. Edwin rose to leave, though unwillingly, but Big James asked him in polite reproach whether he should not stay for the first song. He nodded, encouraged, and sat down. He did not know that the uppermost idea in Big James's mind for an hour past had been that Edwin would hear him sing. Mr Peake lifted his glass, held it from him, approached his lips towards it, and emptied it at a draught. He then glanced round and said thickly "Gentlemen all, Mr Smallrice, Mr Harracles, Mr Rompick, and Mr Yarlett will now oblige with one of the old favourites." There was some applause, a few coats were removed, and Mr Peake fixed himself in a contemplative attitude. THREE. Ms. Arthur Smallrice, Abraham Harracles, Jos Rawnpike, and James Yarlett rose, stepped heavily on to the little platform, and stood in a line with their hands in their pockets. As a bird is known by its note, was hidden by the rampart of their shoulders. They had no music. They knew the music. They had sung it 1,000 times. They knew precisely the effects which they wished to produce, and the means of production. They worked together like an inspired machine. Mr Arthur Smallrice gave a rapid glance into a corner, and from that corner a concertina spoke one short note. Then began, with no hesitating, shuffling preliminaries, nor mute consultations, the singing of that classic quartet, justly celebrated from Hull to Wigan, and from Northallerton to Lichfield, "Loud Ocean's Roar." The thing was performed with absolute assurance and perfection. Mr Arthur Smallrice did the yapping of the short waves on the foam-veiled rocks, and Big James in fullest grandeur did the long and mighty rolling of the deep. It was majestic, terrific, and overwhelming. Many bars before the close, Edwin was thrilled as by an exquisite and vast revelation. He tingled from head to foot. He had never heard any singing like it, or any singing in any way comparable to it. He had never guessed that song held such possibilities of emotion. The pure and fine essential qualities of the voices, the dizzying harmonies, the fugal calls and responses, the strange relief of the unisons, and above all the free natural mien of the singers, proudly aware that they were producing something beautiful that could not be produced more beautifully, conscious of unchallenged supremacy, all this enfevered him to an unprecedented and self-astonished enthusiasm. He murmured under his breath, as Loud Ocean's Roar died away and the little voices of the street supervened, "By Gad! By Gad!" The applause was generous. Edwin stamped and clapped with childlike violence and fury. Mr Peake slowly and regularly thumped one fist on the bench, puffing the while. Glasses and mugs could be seen, but not heard, dancing. Mr Arthur Smallrice, Mr Abraham Harracles, Mr Jos Rawnpike, and Mr James Yarlett, entirely inattentive to the acclamations, stepped heavily from the platform and sat down. When Edwin caught Big James's eye, he clapped again, reanimating the general approval, and Big James gazed at him with bland satisfaction. Mr Enoch Peake was now, save for the rise and fall of his great chest, as immobile and brooding as an Indian god. FOUR. Edwin did not depart. He reflected that, even if his father should come home earlier than the last train, and prove curious, it would be impossible for him to know the exact moment at which his son had been able to have speech with Mr Enoch Peake on the important matter of business. For aught his father could ever guess, he might have been prevented from obtaining the attention of the chairman of the proceedings until, say, 11 o'clock. Also, he meant to present his conduct to his father in the light of an enterprising and fearless action, showing a marked aptitude for affairs. Mr Enoch Peake, whom his father was anxious to flatter, had desired his father's company at the Dragon, and to save the situation Edwin had courageously gone instead. That was it. Besides, he would have stayed in any case. His mind was elevated above the fear of consequences. There was some concertina playing, with a realistic imitation of church bells borne on the wind from a distance, and then the Bursley Prize handbell ringers, or campanologists, produced a whole family of real bells from under a form, and the ostler and the two women arranged a special table, and the campanologists fixed their bells on it, and themselves around it, and performed a selection of Scotch and Irish airs, without once deceiving themselves as to the precise note which a chosen bell would emit when duly shaken. Singular as was this feat, it was far less so than a young man's performance of the ophicleide, a serpentine instrument that coiled around and about its player, and when breathed into persuasively gave forth prodigious brassy sounds that resembled the night noises of beasts of prey. This item roused the Indian god from his umbilical contemplations, and as the young ophicleide player, somewhat breathless, passed down the room with his brazen creature in his arms, Mr Enoch Peake pulled him by the jacket-tail. "Eh!" said Mr Enoch Peake. "Is that the ophicleide as thy father used to play at the old church?" "Yes, Mr Peake," said the young man, with bright respect. Mr Peake dropped his eyes again, and when the young man had gone, he murmured to his stomach, "I well knowed it were the ophicleide as his father used to play at the old church." And suddenly starting up, he continued hoarsely, "Gentlemen all, Mr James Yarlett will now kindly oblige with the Miller of the Dee." And one of the women relighted his pipe and served him with beer. FIVE. Big James's rendering of the Miller of the Dee had been renowned in the Five Towns since 1852. It was classical, hallowed. It was the only possible rendering of the Miller of the Dee. If the greatest bass in the world had come incognito to Bursley and sung the Miller of the Dee, people would have said, "Ah, but ye should hear Big James sing it." It suited Big James. The sentiments of the song were his sentiments. He expressed them with natural simplicity, but at the same time they underwent a certain refinement at his hands. For even when he sang at his loudest, Big James was refined, natty, and restrained. His instinctive gentlemanliness was invincible and all-pervading, and the real beauty and enormous power of his magnificent voice saved him by its mere distinction from the charge of being finicking. The simple sound of the voice gave pleasure, and the simple production of that sound was Big James's deepest joy. Amid all the expected loud applause, the giant looked naively for Edwin's boyish mad enthusiasm, and felt it, and was thrilled and very glad that he had brought Edwin. As for Edwin, Edwin was humbled that he should have been so blind to what Big James was. He had always regarded Big James as a dull, decent, somewhat peculiar fellow in a dirty apron, who was his father's foreman. He had actually talked once to Big James of the wonderful way in which Maggie and Clara sang, and Big James had been properly respectful. But the singing of Maggie and Clara was less than nothing, the crudest amateurism, compared to these public performances of Big James's. Even the accompanying concertina was far more cleverly handled than the Clayhanger piano had ever been handled. Yes, Edwin was humbled. And he had a great wish to be able to do something brilliantly himself, he knew not what. The intoxication of the desire for glory was upon him, as he sat amid those shirt-sleeved men, near the brooding Indian god, under a crawling bluish canopy of smoke, gazing absently at the legend, "As a bird is known by its note." After an interval, during which Mr Enoch Peake was roused more than once, a man with a Lancashire accent recited a poem entitled "The Patent Hairbrushing Machine," the rotary hairbrush being at that time an exceedingly piquant novelty that had only been heard of in the barbers' shops of the Five Towns, though travellers to Manchester could boast that they had sat under it. As the principle of the new machine was easily grasped, and the sensations induced by it easily imagined, the recitation had a success which was indicated by slapping of thighs and great blowings off of mirth. But Mr Enoch Peake preserved his tranquillity throughout it, and immediately it was over he announced with haste, "Gentlemen all, Miss Florence Simcox, or shall us say Mrs Offlow, wife of the gentleman who has just obliged, the champion female clog dancer of the Midlands, will now oblige." SIX. These words put every man whom they surprised into a state of unusual animation. And they surprised most of the company. It may be doubted whether a female clog dancer had ever footed it in Bursley. Several public houses possessed local champions, of a street, of a village, but these were emphatically not women. Enoch Peake had arranged this daring item in the course of his afternoon's business at Cocknage Gardens, Mr Offlow being an expert in ratting terriers, and Mrs Offlow happening to be on a tour with her husband through the realms of her championship, a tour which mingled the varying advantages derivable from terriers, recitations, and clogs. The affair was therefore respectable beyond cavil. Nevertheless, when Florence shone suddenly at the service door, the shortness of her red and black velvet skirts, and the undeniable complete visibility of her rounded calves, produced an uneasy and agreeable impression that Enoch Peake, for a chairman of the Mutual Burial Club, had gone rather far, superbly far, and that his moral ascendancy over Louisa Loggerheads must indeed be truly astonishing. Louisa now stood gravely behind the dancer in the shadow of the doorway, and the contrast between her and Florence was in every way striking enough to prove what a wonderful and mysterious man Enoch Peake was. Florence was accustomed to audiences. She was a pretty, doll-like woman, if inclined to amplitude, but the smile between those shaking golden ringlets had neither the modesty, nor the false modesty, nor the docility that Bursley was accustomed to think proper to the face of woman. It could have stared down any man in the place, except perhaps Mr Peake. The gestures of Mr Offlow, and her gestures as he arranged and prepared the surface of the little square dancing board that was her throne, showed that he was the husband of Florence Simcox rather than she the wife of Offlow the reciter and dog fancier. Further, it was his role to play the concertina to her. He had had to learn the concertina, possibly a secret humiliation for one whose judgement in terriers was not excelled in many public houses. SEVEN. She danced, and the service doorway showed a vista of open-mouthed scullions. There was no sound in the room save the concertina and the champion clogs. Every eye was fixed on those clogs. Even the little eyes of Mr Peake quitted the button of his waistcoat and burned like diamond points on those clogs. Florence herself chiefly gazed on those clogs, but occasionally her nonchalant, petulant gaze would wander up and down her bare arms and across her bosom. At intervals, with her ringed fingers, she would lift the short skirt, a nothing, an imperceptibility, half an inch, with glance downcast, and the effect was profound, recondite, inexplicable. Her style was not that of a male clog dancer, but it was indubitably clog dancing, full of marvels to the connoisseur, and to the profane naught but a highly complicated series of wooden noises. Florence's face began to perspire. Then the concertina ceased playing. so that an undistracted attention might be given to the supremely difficult final figures of the dance. And thus was rendered back to the people, in the charming form of beauty, that which the instinct of the artist had taken from the sordid ugliness of the people. The clog, the very emblem of the servitude and the squalor of brutalised populations, was changed on the light feet of this favourite into the medium of grace. Few of these men but at some time of their lives had worn the clog, had clattered in it through winter's slush and through the freezing darkness before dawn, to the manufactory and the mill and the mine, whence, after a day of labour under discipline more than military, they had clattered back to their little candle-lighted homes. One of the slatterns behind the doorway actually stood in clogs to watch the dancer. The clog meant everything that was harsh, foul, and desolating. It summoned images of misery and disgust. Yet on those feet that had never worn it seriously, it became the magic instrument of pleasure, waking dulled wits and forgotten aspirations, putting upon every one an enchantment. And then suddenly the dancer threw up one foot as high as her head, and brought two clogs down together like a double mallet on the board, and stood still. It was over. Mrs Louisa Loggerheads turned nervously away, pushing her servants in front of her. And when the Society of Mutual Buriers had recovered from the startling, shameless insolence of that last high kick, it gave the rein to its panting excitement, and roared and stamped. Edwin was staggered. The blood swept into his face, a hot tide. He was ravished, but he was also staggered. He did not know what to think of Florence, the champion female clog dancer. He felt that she was wondrous. He felt that he could have gazed at her all night. But he felt that she had put him under the necessity of reconsidering some of his fundamental opinions. For example, he was obliged to admit within himself a lessening of scorn for the attitude towards each other of Miss Ingamells and her young man. He saw those things in a new light. And he reflected, dazzled by the unforeseen chances of existence: "Yesterday I was at school, and to day I see this." He was so preoccupied by his own intimate sensations that the idea of applauding never occurred to him until he perceived his conspicuousness in not applauding, whereupon he clapped self-consciously. EIGHT. Miss Florence Simcox, somewhat breathless, tripped away with simulated coyness and many curtsies. She had done her task, and as a woman she had to go. This was a gathering of members of the Mutual Burial Club, a masculine company, and not meet for females. The men pulled themselves together, remembering that their proudest quality was a stoic callousness that nothing could overthrow. They refilled pipes, ordered more beer, and resumed the mask of invulnerable solemnity. "Aye!" muttered Mr Enoch Peake. Edwin, with a great effort, rose and walked out. He would have liked to say good night to Big James. He did not deny that he ought to have done so, but he dared not complicate his exit. On the pavement outside, in the warm damp night, a few loitering listeners stood doggedly before an open window, hearkening, their hands deep in their pockets, motionless. And Edwin could hear Mr Enoch Peake: "Gentlemen all, Mr Arthur Smallrice, Mr Abraham Heracles, and Mr Jos Rampick, and Mr James Yarlett." Chapter 10, Volume 1.